Oh, goodness. Pop music, you are so very problematic. And now, thanks to Trolls World Tour, now even the children be knowing. Before we talk about pop music, let me give you a brief overview of this categorical dragging of pop music and perhaps other things disguised as an animated movie targeted towards children. Trolls World Tour is a sequel to the 2016 animated film Trolls. In the sequel, Poppy lives in a world where she believes she and the other pop troll citizens are the center of the universe. They literally don't even know that other trolls exist. And she is the queen of this troll, what she thinks is the universe. And she doesn't even know any other trolls exist until her father, the immediate past king of the trolls, begrudgingly shares a map that still centers Poppy and the pop trolls. But it also shows that there are other trolls, minding their troll business and living their non-pop singing lives. And then her father gives her a false narrative as to why everyone lives separately and conveniently leaving out that pop trolls stole from everyone. And then Poppy decides to go to these other worlds and then attempts to foster her style of music on everyone else. And her whole thing is we're all trolls, we're all the same, and we should all sing happy pop music, and my way is the best way. And then the funk trolls, who are clearly supposed to be African-American, they had to lovingly let her know, no, we're not all the same. That's okay. And BTW, your ancestors, the pop trolls, stole from everyone. So I was watching this movie with my children, and I was like, is it just me, or are they really getting into something deeper here, even more than appropriation, right? So let's talk about it. I'm really excited to explore the deeper meaning of what I think Trolls World Tour was trying to scratch the surface of with Dr. Jack Hamilton. Jack is a cultural historian who studies sound media and popular culture and is an associate professor in the media studies department. I'm sorry, I'm going to say it again. And is an associate professor of media studies and American studies at UVA. He is a pop critic for Slate Magazine, and he writes about music, sports, and other areas of culture. His first book, Just Around Midnight, Rock and Roll and the Racial Imagination, focused on the transatlantic interplay of popular music and racial thought during the 1960s, and explores how rock and roll music moved from being an interracial type of music to being widely understood as white. I'm going to say that again. Explores how rock and roll music moved from being an interracial type of music to being widely understood as a white one by the end of the decade. Dr. Hamilton is currently working on a book about music and technology since the 1960s. Hi, Jack. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Woo! So let's establish a baseline. Historically, why is pop music such a contentious genre?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think largely because I think, American music, the sort of history of American music is basically Black American music. And so American pop music is disproportionately influenced by the music of Black Americans, and sort of like that is the outsized influence in American popular music. And as, anyone knows, African American musicians have not historically been adequately compensated or recognized for the contributions that they've made to this history, particularly in an economic sense. And so that, I think, is really, a lot of what it boils down to is that this is an area of American culture in which Black artists have had an absolutely outsized influence. I mean, another area you could probably make this argument about too would be sports. But music is probably, in terms of, going all the way back to basically the beginning of, American culture, whatever you want to say that starts, like this is the story of it. And so it's definitely something that pop music, is a place where these issues of, quote unquote appropriation and, sort of racial exploitation, and just sort of economic exploitation, economic injustice, you can go sort of all down the line. They've been really, really prominent. And this is particularly true, I would say, the kind of concept of pop music really emerges with the recording industry. And certainly, so it's like, the history of the recording industry in the United States is like, which starts at really at the beginning of the 20th century. Like these issues are just incredibly prominent from the very, very beginning. And so it's certainly like, yeah, I mean, it's just like, it is, you know, you could certainly argue that it is the central issue in the history of particularly American popular music.
And I definitely want to get into the recording piece and some of these other pieces that you touched on. So according to an article by the History Channel named How Race Records Turned Black Music into Big Business, the writer Aaron Blakemore says America had segregated schools, buses, and Black people had to watch movies and theatrical performances from hot, dirty balconies and were excluded from much of white culture, especially in the Jim Crow South. And even popular culture was segregated. Race, media, music, films, and publications were created by and for African Americans and white audiences who seldom knew or cared about these creative art forms. White record labels, which had been losing market share with the introduction of radio, could easily exploit and underpay Black artists more than white ones. Many of their songs had never been published, and labels snagged recording rights along with the recordings. And many artists were put on records that gave them pseudonyms or left out their names entirely. And then she goes, well, I don't know if Aaron is a man or a woman, but Aaron goes on to say that countless others were recorded without contracts and without being paid royalties, since Black artists were mostly excluded from the American Society of Composers, Artists, and Performers. And the few that did have royalty agreements didn't have much chance of enforcing them. And then, you know, eventually white audiences caught on to Black music. And the writer goes on to say, and I'm sure you would probably agree with this, that race records were rebranded as rhythm and blues, AKA R&B. So how do pop music's roots intersect with race records?
Yeah, I mean, very directly. I mean, like this is something. So pop music, the concept of it is like, it's a really weird and broad concept. Like, you know, if you ask someone to define what pop music is, you know, you're going to get like a different answer from everyone because no one totally knows what it means. Basically, what it means is a commercial designation. You know, pop means something, you know, in the words of Berry Gordy, the founder of Motown Records, pop means popular. Like, who doesn't want music to be popular? But basically, like, American pop music has tended to, particularly in this age of, you know, sort of the recording era. So two things that happen in the 1920s is that there's a development of, so there basically, as you mentioned, the sort of race records category is established and become, I mean, this is in 1920, Mamie Smith records Crazy Blues, and it sells over 100,000 copies. And this is the recording that makes the record industry aware of, like, oh my God, there's this massive market for Black recorded music. And that's really early. You know, 1920 is when the record industry is like basically pretty new. And then similarly in the 1920s, you also get the rise of sort of white Southern music, which was billed as hillbilly music. And a lot of people have argued that, like, that tradition of sort of like what comes to be known as country music and then what comes to be known as blues or R&B are really originate in the same, like, they're kind of the same music when you get to the the bottom of them. It's just that they were segregated out by the industry to create these sort of markets. There's a great book about this actually called Segregating Sound. It's written by a colleague of mine at UVA named Carl Hagster Miller. But so what happens is, like, particularly by the 20s and 30s, a lot of what's showing up in the pop charts is actually music. I mean, this is particularly true with you know, sort of Black music, race records and stuff. So, you know, the big you know, commercially popular music of the 20s and particularly the 30s is really jazz and like swing, you know, swing jazz. And sometimes a lot of times this was jazz that was being performed by white artists. So, you know, Benny Goodman or like Paul Whiteman or something. But you also had people like Duke Ellington. You know, Louis Armstrong was a massively successful performer in the 20s and 30s. Cab Calloway, you know, Count Basie. So this is like, and that was pop music in that day. I mean, it's weird for us now, I think, to think of jazz as being pop music, but it was, you know, like really for quite a long time. So this question of sort of like, and sometimes country music became pop music too. Like this is something like Hank Williams had like a lot of his songs like made the pop chart, even if it wasn't him performing them. So it's like, yeah, so you have these, so it's sort of the pop charts are kind of taking all of this stuff from other places, you know, and sort of like, and figuring out ways to sort of sell it to the most amount of people. But pop music itself, you know, I think what we could both agree that like, you know, country music, for instance, or R&B music, is like rooted in like a real historical tradition, you know, whereas it's like pop music, like there's not really, because it's always been something that's just sort of feeding off anything that it can. So there's less of a sort of, you know, you turn on like top 40 radio and like any given moment, like you're going to hear stuff that sounds like really different. Whereas it's like, you know, if you turn on a country radio station, even today, or you turn on you know, an R&B radio station. I mean, today the term they use is urban for that format, but it's like you're going to hear music that sounds like probably fairly similar to each other, you know, on those types of radio formats, or you know, a more recent one would be like rock radio or something like that. Whereas you turn on a top 40 station, you're going to hear all sorts of stuff. Because there's not really like a musical definition of what it is outside of just like whatever's selling the most at a given time. Sorry, that was probably a long-winded example, but
no, that makes sense. And it's so funny that you bring up urban, because I want to talk about that. So as it relates to cover records, but when I was looking at sort of like when people consider the origination of pop, they say like the 1950s, right? Is that, would you agree?
Yeah,
with
I mean,
that?
I would say for our modern conception of pop, like that's probably true. You know, like especially the idea that like, especially thinking about pop as a music that's fundamentally associated with young people, then I think the 50s is where you start to see that. Like the way we think of pop music today kind of originates then. Yeah.
Okay, so then in the 1950s, white performers started covering, meaning that they were singing the same songs that Black artists would make. And then they were introduced as pop, and they were singing the exact same song. And then they would make more money, even if, you know, sometimes the Black people were paid very little. And then they would sing the same song and then make all of this money from it. So, and then it was interesting to know that 1950s is considered the time that pop music was considered to have its birth, but then also that's like also when you start seeing cover records. So I think that's really sort of like an interesting and maybe even convenient time.
Yeah, totally. So like the kind of quintessential example of what you're describing is a guy named Pat Boone, who is actually a Canadian singer. He was a white Canadian singer. And in the 50s, he was like very notorious for basically, he covered Little Richard, he covered Fats Domino. And, you know, this was at a period too when both of those artists, Little Richard and Fats Domino, had big pop hits. But as soon as Pat Boone took their music and like, you know, I mean, and they made some money because they had like, you know, the songwriting and stuff like that. But like, you know, like you had a lot of radio stations that were like, oh, suddenly we have Little Richard doing Tutti Frutti, which Little Richard wrote. And we have Pat Boone doing this like really terrible version of Tutti Frutti, but he's white and he's got this kind of like white, like he looked like a TV star kind of thing. So they're like, well, why don't we just play this guy instead? You know, so Little Richard starts seeing his sales drop because he's not getting promoted on radio. And yeah, it was like it was a real issue in the 50s, certainly. And you know, some of that too had to do with the fact that like a lot of the people marketing rock and roll music like didn't totally understand what it was that was interesting to people. Like it wasn't taken seriously. It was seen as a fad. So it was like, well, what's the difference between Little Richard and Pat Boone? You know, if you're like a 50-year-old white radio programmer, like it probably all kind of sounds the same to you in the 1950s. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I mean, if you go back and listen to, I mean, the Pat Boone stuff is like pretty atrocious. Like it's just like terrible. Like it's so boring and kind of like whereas Little Richard is still like, you know, so exciting and kind of thrilling. Right. But like yeah, but that definitely happened. The cover song phenomenon of the 50s.
So as it relates to, you brought up urban. So Warner Music Group plans to stop using the term urban to refer to Black music by Black artists. I don't know if you heard about that. I'm sure I've
heard that. Yeah, I know that like that's a term that like is now starting to be some places are getting rid of it. So and iHeartRadio, the largest radio company in the United States, plans to phase out urban. They are just going to use hip hop and R&B instead.
But even with that, there's a 2020 article published by the Rolling Stone entitled Separate and Unequal, How Pop Music Holds Black Artists Back. The writer Elias Late says, to get rid of the urban category while not wiping out pop simultaneously amounts to a new frosting on the same old cake, preserving a system in which Adele and Jazmine Sullivan could sing the same exact song with identical power and grace, but Adele's version will go straight into every supermarket across the country, while Sullivan's will be pushed only to Black listeners in select cities. In your opinion, is R&B essentially the Jim Crow section?
It's certainly, yeah. I mean, in certain instances, I think you could argue that, like that one that he gives there is like that's a great example. Like that, it's like, why is Adele's music, like Adele is a soul singer, like she's an R&B singer, like that's
exactly.
all of her
that's
influence.
Exactly
like,
what she
like,
is.
Yeah, and so it's like, why does she get this like different category than like, you know, like even an equivalently huge star like Beyonce is like doesn't get that sort of like weird pop thing that Adele gets, I would argue, and certainly not someone like Jazmine Sullivan. But yeah, I mean, so it's interesting because it's like the question of R&B and its sort of segregation is like it's has historically been actually like pretty complicated, because there was also a period too where like the R&B industry really saw itself as like something else, and they saw their audience as something, you know, different, to be sort of, you know, that was like, oh, we're serving this particular audience that's like not serving, that is not, you know, interested in what's on pop radio. So like, for instance, like a classic example, like this was big, certainly true in like this sort of late 70s and early 80s, where it's like you had people like Teddy Pendergrass, for instance, or even Luther Vandross, who were massively successful R&B stars and didn't really see a lot of pop crossover. But like they and their fans, by that like their own telling, were fine with that, because they were like, we're like, that's not what we do. You turn on pop radio in the early 80s and you're going to hear like, you know, Christopher Cross and stuff. And like, that was not what Teddy Pendergrass.
So like, yes, we would call Teddy Pendergrass and Luther Vandross Black famous.
That's right. Totally. Yeah. Exactly. And then it's like, you see that kind of like change in the mid 80s, like where certainly, so, I mean, like the big shift is Michael Jackson, you know, comes on and like Thriller, which is like, but then it's like, so one of the reasons, like, this is something that like, it's some, like not all, I think people have forgotten, but like someone like Whitney Houston was actually fairly controversial in the mid to late 80s.
That's a great example.
Because she was a huge pop star who certain R&B audiences didn't really like, because they were like, you didn't, you know, you're not on our radio. You're going straight to,
didn't know that.
Like, kind of like, yeah, totally. So it's like there's like famous instance of, she got booed at the, I think it was the Soul Train Awards. She won in like 1989. She won like, you know, best female vocalist, and the crowd booed her because they were like they thought it was basically like bogus that this like pop singer, you know, even though she was Black and obviously was an incredible singer, they like the fact that she had beaten artists who they saw as more sort of like in line with R&B. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, so it's kind of it's like a really complicated question, but generally speaking, I would say like, yeah, I mean, like, you know, most musicians, it's like, you know, most musicians want that pop success. Like they want those sales, you know? And so like these situations in which like R&B is kind of getting kept off pop radio, and like there's not those opportunities for artists to cross over into that mainstream, like most artists will tell you, like, that's really, you know, that's bad. Like it's like, they don't want that, you know, like it's like, you want artists want to make money. You know, they want to have their music reach as many people as possible. And so certainly, yeah, I mean, like, I think that's, you know, and that's what's sort of interesting about like if you were to get rid of like the sort of urban category, or, you know, if you were to eliminate, like make one big chart, you know, which I think is like, you know, it sounds like good in theory, but like the way that the industry has historically worked, it's like, you're just like, it's going to probably end up just being like, you know, white artists get favored, you know, for various reasons. I mean, it's racism, but it's like, you know, that's just something that has been, like, you just see that pattern sort of happen again and again and again.
So, and then like, I think about, there's the other example this summer with was it this summer or no, must have been last summer. Like everything's run together. Megan Thee Stallion.
Mm-hmm.
Megan Thee Stallion invented Hot Girl Summer, the Hot Girl Summer meme. And she released a single that was an urban radio, success. And then a white singer, Black Bear, created his own concept called Hot Girl Bummer. Did you hear about this?
No, I didn't hear about this.
Oh, it was played heavily on pop radio.
I knew about Hot Girl Summer, but I didn't know the.
Me neither. I didn't know about that either. But apparently, so apparently it was played very heavily on pop radio. And then since that format reaches more listeners, it got 93 million impressions, and compared to 36 million. So Hot Girl Bummer has nearly 160 million more streams than Hot Girl Summer.
Wow. Yeah.
So that's crazy.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's like, and that is, yeah. I mean, like this is.
I've never even heard of Hot Girl Bummer. I'm like, oh, maybe I don't know. I'd never heard of a Hot Girl. I thought maybe you had heard of it. I don't know.
No, I hadn't. Yeah, no, I hadn't heard of it.
But just because of the simple categorization of it being pop and then it reaching more audiences, it's.
Yeah. I mean, it's weird. Like
this is what you're talking about. This is what
So for when I was growing up, like the music that I was most interested in, like that I was like the biggest fan of when I was like a kid and was listening to the radio a lot was hip hop. And like I listened to hip hop radio like all the time, and that was like certainly like its own form. Like in New York, it was like Hot 97.
Did you grow up in New York?
No, I grew up in Boston actually, but I went to college in New York.
Okay, because I'm 42. I'm 42. How old are you?
41. So
you were essentially raised during like the golden age of hip hop.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So go ahead. Yeah. I was just trying to like.
Well, what was interesting, which like you probably, I'm sure you remember from that era, was like it was pretty hard for rappers to get on top 40 radio. Like it was like that was like, I mean the rappers who were on top 40 radio in like the late 80s and early 90s were like Hammer, Vanilla Ice, like stuff that was like, and if you knew hip hop, you were like, where is like the good stuff? And it finally starts to get on it, like certainly someone like Biggie had pop hits, and like Dr. Dre and the Chronic and stuff was like that definitely hit onto top 40. But like it was a while before like and certainly in the 80s like hip hop really wasn't on top 40 radio very much. And and then there was like this sort of weird like you'd have hip hop artists who do collaborations with R&B artists or pop artists, and like that was a way that you could get on the radio, was by doing something that was, because even actually like, I mean, a lot of R&B stations didn't even play hip hop, that was something that was like, or certain R&B stations were, because their listeners were like, I don't want to hear that.
Like WBLS.
Right. Totally. And so it's like, yeah, so it's weird. This is like this, yeah, it's like so that's always been like kind of a strange thing, like in terms of, and I think today, I don't listen to like radio very much anymore.
Yeah.
So
you
it's like
satellite, right?
Yeah, or like just very like,
or like you streaming services.
Yeah, right? Exactly, mm-hmm. And like yeah, but it's weird. Like I was listening to a couple years ago. I was in LA for like a week I was hanging out. I was with a friend, and we rented a car, and we were like driving around a lot, and we were listening to radio a lot. And we were listening to whatever the Power, whatever the big LA hip hop station is. We were listening to that a lot, and it was sort of interesting because that's now basically I mean, that's one of the biggest radio stations in LA. And it was interesting the stuff that they were playing, because it's sort of a hip hop station, but it's also kind of top 40-ish. They play like they play non-hip hop, certainly. Like they were playing a lot of like Rihanna and stuff like that, sort of hip hop influenced pop music. But like, but it was it was like, Drake was on all the time, but like also like Post Malone was on all the time, like who's certainly someone who's like, there's a lot to be said about Post Malone and like, the fact that he gets on radio formats that like a lot of other hip hop artists won't get on, and it's because he's white, and he's got this sort of crowd I think there's a lot of people. I think there's a lot of white people who listen to Post Malone's music that don't listen to other hip hop. And like that's weird. You know, it was like that with Eminem too. And it was like that with the Beastie Boys before. You know, even like that was like that's always been like this sort of weird phenomenon, I think.
And to your point, almost like the segregation of radio, like when I was a teenager, like I said, you're 41 and so we're contemporaries. Like I grew up in Westchester. Like I grew up basically New York City suburb. So like I would listen to Hot 97 for my rap. And when I wanted to listen to other stuff, I would listen to Z100. That's literally like what I would do. And then I would like to your point, when you were saying like R&B, like the R&B station was WBLS. You know, so I started this episode talking about trolls because I felt what they were talking about was more than just appropriation. And I even think appropriation, it tends to get reduced to can white people do non-white things, which I'm actually a little tired of that word because it's kind of like reductive, like the way that people talk about it. You know, the lead troll, Poppy, she's raised to believe she's literally the only type of troll, which I think is actually very significant and intentional. Like, the world is centered around me. I'm the only, you know, we're the only types of trolls that exist, right? And her father actually went to great lengths to hide other trolls from her. Like they, you know, until the hard rock trolls like force his hand. And to me, what they were actually talking about, the way that I interpreted it was about erasure. Like, we're not even going to acknowledge your existence. And what I found to be even more interesting was the fact that like it was the funk trolls who delivered the message. Like there were these trolls who are obviously supposed to be Black, right? You can just tell, like, even though they're all trolls, it's like these people are obviously Black. And they're like, you know, hey, your ancestors are problematic, you know? There are many that would argue that pop is racialized. It's, you know, in the way that R&B is racialized, that term pop is racialized. So the question that the Rolling Stones the writer from the article that I brought up, he's actually exploring, okay, we're getting rid of urban. Should we get rid of pop too? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, it's hard because it's like these things exist in so many different kind of ways. So there's like the charts, you know, that it's like, there's like, and like the Billboard charts and like that, like, those have changed so much, like even just in terms of like the way that like, so I mean the two basic like commercial sort of modes of musical genre making are charts. So it's like you got like, you know, which is, you know, are published in Billboard, which is like the industry magazine. And then radio, you know, so it's like format radio. So it's like, you know, the idea that like there's like country stations and there's, you know, R&B stations and there, you know, like we were just talking, and then there's top 40, and top 40 is like what pop is for radio. And both of those things are like first of all, like no one buys music anymore. Or like right. Gone are the days of something like it's like I was just
Tower Records.
Yeah, like I was just reading a book about music in the year 1984. It was really great. It's coming out. It's called Can't Slow Down. Just a little plug there. But like it was talking like that was the year. 84 is the year that Thriller went into the Guinness Book of World Records as the highest selling album ever. And like I was looking at that like, and I was just like, God, like Thriller sold so many copies, and it's just like it is gonna hold that record forever because like it's just like there's just no music. Like I don't even know if an album like Thriller sold like
my 8-year-old knows what Thriller is.
Yeah, it's like I think it's by some estimates it's sold over 100 million copies, and like I don't even know that an album is ever going to sell 10 million copies again. Like it's just like, you know, it's just because of the way that we listen to music.
Consume,
And then radio too, you know, it's like I don't know how many people, like, you know, like we were saying, like I don't listen to the radio, like terrestrial radio, you know, like commercial radio very much anymore. And like stuff like Spotify or, you know, Apple Music or whatever are able to give people like a much more
curated,
personalized experience. Yeah. And certainly there's like there's genre playlists on Spotify. Like I know that Spotify's like Rap Caviar playlist is like really, really important to you know, certainly like up and coming rappers. If you get something on that, it's huge. but I don't think it's the same as like, like radio programmers deciding, like really being able to be like, okay, we're going to make this song a hit, or like, whatever. And so, so it's like, thinking about pop, like it's like pop as like an industry shorthand, like as something that governs the way music is sold. And that I think like you could see change a lot. Like I think we've already seen it change a lot because of the fact that like music isn't selling in the same ways that it did. And just no one's quite sure how to market music anymore. Like there's not this sort of like twin, like it used to be that it was just like music was about going to a record store and buying it, or getting it on the radio, or then slightly later getting it on MTV. But like, but the idea of pop, like that it's like if you hear something and you're like, that's pop, or like, that's like listeners, I think, are always going to think in terms of genres because it's like they're connected to them. It's like certainly like, like hip hop fans are super invested in being like, this is hip hop, this isn't hip hop. Like it's like
policing. There's definitely a policing of hip hop that happens. Exactly,
and there is with rock too. There certainly is with country too. So those kinds of things, it's like because listeners become invested in them, and sometimes artists become invested in them as well. Whereas like pop doesn't really have that so much. Like it's like I don't think there's that many pop fans that are like snobbish about like what they consider to be like it's just kind of different, because it's so purely linked to commercialism. So I think in some ways, like, I think the concept of pop as it's historically functioned as like an industry thing, you could see that like start to go away. I mean, I would argue that it already kind of has started to go away, at least in the way
I wonder if they're two sides of the same coin. R&B pop. Like, are they just racialized terms, coded language, right? Like these like race neutral terms that are actually supposed to be identifying race.
Yeah, totally.
I mean? So I wonder what progress looks like as it relates to that.
Yeah, and it's also like an interesting, like something else that's become much more of a prominent thing in like the in recent years is like Latin musical influences, which like didn't used to be all that prominent in American pop, and like now they're all over the place, on the radio. And it's like one thing that like American music has always tended to think of itself as is binary, of like it's like there's black music and white music, and like you're now seeing like other categories that are coming in, and like it's like, wait, what do we exactly and so like what do you like where like that too is like kind of like frazzling out where pop is. Like it's like I was in the book that I wrote about that was about the 60s, where in the 60s was definitely a time when everyone kind of took for granted that it was like a black white divide, but kind of at the end of the 60s, Carlos Santana like hits the scene, and he's sort of the first major Chicano rock star. And it's like one of the things that's like was so funny was like reading old music criticism from that period, and like no one knew how to talk about him because it was like
he's rock.
Yeah, and it was like he just like because he fell outside of these like stereotypes that people had created, so it was like so it's it is like I think but it's certainly I think that the sort of white black dichotomy will definitely continue to probably like dominate the way a lot of music is thought about for a long time and marketed, frankly.
But what does progress look like for you? Like in the way that they're urban is being phased out, right? Because it's a coded term that marginalizes folks. Music for you. How would you, so for example, like the Eminems and the Post Malones and those people, right? Jazmine Sullivan and Adele. What category should they be in? Like where would you like to see these people? Well, Post Malone, I think Post Malone, right, and Eminem are in their correct category. So I think Jazmine Sullivan and Adele would be a better example. Like where would you like to see both of them?
Well, like I would like to see Jazmine Sullivan have like the same success that Adele has. I think that's sort of like, and I think that is something. I do think that in recent years, like these, and I think you're right that I find a lot of the sort of like conversations about sort of appropriation to be like at a certain point, it's like hits a wall, and you're just like, because they're so complicated and there's so much stuff going on, and it's hard to reduce things. But it's like, I do think that there has been in recent years more of an attempt, particularly among artists, to acknowledge influences and like sort of try to shine spotlight. And certainly throughout history, like there have been some people that have been better about doing that than others. But that was certainly something like, someone like Eminem, who obviously has like a lot of issues and there's a lot of problematic things about Eminem's music, but like something Eminem like
I thought you were going to say just him being problematic. I didn't know
totally,
his music.
totally.
Okay.
But something Eminem has always been, I think like people respect about him in hip hop is that he's been very, very open about acknowledging his influences, about like putting on, bringing with him like Black rappers who he grew up around in Detroit and like giving them huge label deals and like making, like using his fame to like boost up other people, which is certainly something, going back, if you go back to like, whatever people think about Elvis, like Elvis didn't really do that, like that wasn't something, and Eminem is kind of an Elvis figure, I think. And he really did like, use his, and that's one of the reasons why like it's like Eminem has a lot of respect in like the sort of hip hop community, in part because he did that. And I don't know that Post Malone has really done the same thing. But yeah, I mean, certainly like someone like Adele, I think like has at times tried to, speak openly about her own sort of like privilege within the industry. And it's like, it's been interesting seeing white artists talk about that more openly, in part because of the fact that I think people have become more aware of it in sort of recent years. But yeah.
So to your point about that, like the commentary that they're making in the movie to me is like very clear. I think for anybody who has a basic knowledge, like you bring up Elvis, you bring up Post Malone, you also bring up Eminem, and the different ways that they sort of acknowledge or don't acknowledge the roots. Like, do you think that pop has an issue with this, acknowledging its Black roots? Do you think, I mean, some of these newer artists who are acknowledging, are they the outlier? Or is it just sort of, we're seeing a trend now of them sort of acknowledging like, hey, this is where I'm taking my roots from?
I think that it's like, I mean, it's always like, you always don't want to be like too like, you don't want to be like too like, yay, progress. But I do think that there has been, a certain degree of progress in terms of like, I mean, and this is something certainly that like, yeah, I mean, like you think about like, this is, we're not in a situation in 2020 where like it was in the 50s, where it was like Black artists just like wouldn't get on pop radio, particularly in certain parts of the country, I mean, like it's like you turn on a top 40 radio station, it's like you're definitely going to hear, artists of color like frequently. But like, yeah, I mean, but I think the real issue is that like, to come back to like this idea of pop music, like because of pop, because it's such an industry thing, it's so openly commercial, it's not itself interested in history, like because history doesn't sell, like, so it's like, so I think that there's always that problem, is that it's like the pop industry is not going to correct its history unless it's like people force it to, because there's not money in like honoring old, what like sort of in like righting historical wrongs. And like what it mostly is about is selling product to people, and this is definitely something that like, it's like, to go back to like the sort of other, these sort of other genres, like a genre like R&B or a genre like country or something, which have like real strong senses of history, like it's like, and that's because like you have audiences that are invested in them.
Is the history of pop cover records? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Although as I was researching for this episode, and I was like, okay, it started in the 1950s, and this is where I'm like, wait, is this the history of pop music, like stealing from other people?
Yeah, I mean, it's weird because it's like these days, actually, like I feel like you don't see the phenomenon of cover music very much at all anymore. And it's weird. Like, it's like, I mean, part of that's because, like, you know, you think about hip hop as like probably the dominant genre of popular hip hop, like doesn't do covers hardly ever, you know, like it's hard to think of. And then certainly also, but what you do have is like a lot of times, like, like throughout, like usually in the, I think one thing that people has been kind of confusing is that like really up until like the 50s and 60s, it was not common for singers to write their own material, like in any genre. You know, there were professional songwriters that held that, that did that, and they gave music to singers. And then you get like, you know, that starts to change. And you had artists that were writing their own music, but like that, and now we've gone back to certainly some artists write their own music, but there's definitely like now much more of like sort of people who are behind the scenes who are writing stuff, and sort of like, can you get your artist, get this song to this artist kind of thing. And like, so that's kind of going back to the older model. And that's where you see that happen a lot in pop, you know, like that it's like there's someone writes, you know, like Max Martin, like the Swedish dude, like it's like, I mean, he's like all over pop radio, and it's like he's written for everyone, because of the fact that it's like, you know, he's if you need a huge hit, you know, and there's just a number of people like that, who've just written for, who's like, you know, aren't people who are super well known, but like if you look at a Beyonce album, or you look at a Katy Perry album, or, you know, whatever, you'll see those names like over and over. And so it's like, yeah. And so that itself, and that's kind of a pop thing too. So it's weird.
Write your own music.
Yeah, like it's like there's like this. I mean, there's all these stories about like these really, really famous songs, like particularly in recent years, that have been like huge hits, and then you'll hear that some other artists like turned it down. You know,
yeah.
I know like Umbrella, like the Rihanna song, that's huge, that was written by like the Dream and Tricky Stewart. A whole bunch of famous artists passed on that song. Like that was like floating around, and people were like, nah, I don't want that, which of course now seems crazy, right. But it's like, you know, but that happens pretty often. So that raises itself like sort of weird questions about like, yeah, that's like, I mean, that's not quite a cover record situation, but you know, it kind of is. And like, yeah, and it's so someone like that, the artist, The Dream, who's like made, I mean, he wrote Umbrella for Rihanna, he wrote Single Ladies for Beyonce, he wrote like, I mean, he's just written tons of like, but his own music, which is really great, has never been able to cross over into the levels that he has seen it when other people do his stuff, which is probably frustrating for him. But like,
I don't understand how the industry works. Like, can't, you know, who decides who's going to be pop and who's going to be R&B?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, that's the thing. It's really hard, like, particularly these days when like, so it used to be like, you know, when the music industry had a lot more power in how they marketed artists and what artists' records they pushed to what formats, you know, like that was like, then it would be like, oh, so like a real famous instance of this was, would be Prince, who when Prince signed to Warner Brothers when he was like 17 years old, one of the things he said was, he was like, I don't want you to, I don't want my music confined to your R&B division. Like he was like, I want, if I sign with Warner Brothers, I want you to put all of your effort into getting my music onto pop radio. And it took a while for him to get it, but like Warner agreed to that. You know, they were like, we're not just going to give your music to our R&B division and just like have you sort of like, because that was during that period that I was talking about when there really wasn't very much R&B crossover to the pop charts. And he wasn't interested in being Teddy Pendergrass. Like he was interested in being, you know, the biggest star in the universe. Yeah. But like, and that was like, so that, but like these days, like a label like Warner, which still very much exists, like they don't have that kind of power anymore, like really, because like no one buys, because like what that is ultimately about is what record stores your product gets put into,
right, and
what radio stations it gets pushed to. And so that's like, yeah, like without those, so it's such a hard question of like, I mean, this is like a great example I think of with this is like, you know, now like the you know, the highest selling single ever, or the number one chart topping pop single ever is Old Town Road by Lil Nas X, who was someone who like didn't have a label when he like made that. Like he came out of nowhere. He like
and
made
then
this
got
song
pushed out of the country.
Right,
totally. Was a whole, that was a whole kerfuffle, right?
Yeah, so it was like this whole like, so there was this weird thing that happened with that, but then it was also like he had the biggest song in the country for like 20 weeks straight or something, like literally a record, and he did that basically himself because like this is the time in this era you don't need a record label anymore.
But even him, he had to fight to get in the country, in the country genre, right, or something like that.
Yeah, so that's one of the things. It's like, and I don't know that much about country, but like, so country is an interesting outlier in this because country radio is still really, really powerful. Like country is still a genre that is like where radio is huge. Like that, it's like country listeners still listen to country radio way more than other audience groups listen to sort of traditional format radio. So there's more like, so if a country radio station decides that they don't want to play Old Town Road because like their audience doesn't want to hear it for whatever reason, or they think their audience doesn't want to hear it, then that's an instance where you can see radio have a real effect in terms of like what's that chart, the country chart. So that's like, that's my understanding of it, at least, was that was like largely due to the power that country radio holds. And that's certainly
and
like,
it was also racialized too.
Totally. Absolutely. I mean, that's what it was like, I mean, I think it was like country audiences or at least country radio programmers thought that their audience would be mad hearing this like young black kid with like a hip hop beat, even though there's a lot of hip hop influence in country. Lil Nas X phenomenon was like, because he was an artist where it's like, like 20 or 30 years earlier, like nobody
would know who he is.
Totally. And instead, like, it's like, so that's like this question of like how any of this is working anymore in terms of like, basically no one knows how to sell music anymore. And so like, you're starting to see like, the industry like doesn't really, so it's kind of an interesting time, and it's like, in some ways that's been really liberating for some artists, but it's also like, it's like it's a bad time to be a musician, in any capacity, because of the fact that it's like, like they're just like, I mean, stuff like Spotify, even if you have like a big hit on Spotify, like you're probably not making that much money from it and stuff. So
So thank you so much for joining us. This was such an interesting conversation. Please tell us the name again of your forthcoming book.
It doesn't have a name yet.
Okay.
It's probably not going to be forthcoming for a little while, but but people can buy my previous book, which is Just Around Midnight: Rock and Roll and the Racial Imagination. It's available like Amazon, anywhere you buy books. So
this is my last question that we ask all of our guests. As you know, the podcast is curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. It's your last night on Earth. Where are you eating?
Oh man, my favorite restaurant ever was, or like it was like a combination of like sentimental and also just the food was awesome. So there used to be a restaurant in Cambridge, Massachusetts called the East Coast Grill. It's not there anymore. It closed down a few years ago, but they specialized in they did like, it was sort of part seafood. They had some barbecue stuff, but it was like they made really spicy food. That was like kind of what they were known for. They used to have this like event called Hell Night where there was just like everything on the menu was like, made with like crazy, like, peppers and stuff. And I just loved that place. It was like so great. And I'm like just always bummed that it's not there anymore. So I think my ideal would be to resurrect that restaurant and like eat there.